Blood pooled in the marble corridors of the palace. Emperor Aurelian lay dead, struck down by his own Praetorian Guard in the autumn of 275. His crime, attempting to discipline the very soldiers sworn to protect him. The murderers barely had time to wipe their blades clean before panic seized them. Who would rule Rome now? This scene would replay with horrifying regularity over the next 50 years. Emperors rose and fell like wheat before the scythe. Some lasted months, others mere weeks. Maximinus Thrax ruled for 3 blood-soaked years before his own troops butchered him outside Aquileia. Philip the Arab governed for 5 years, until Decius cut him down at Verona. Decius himself perished in the Danube marshes, devoured by Gothic spears and Scythian arrows. The crisis consumed everything. 50 emperors in 50 years, most dying violent deaths at the hands of rivals, barbarians, or their own men. Rome's ancient stability crumbled like a temple built on sand. Germanic tribes sensed weakness across the Rhine and Danube. Alemanni raiders swept into Gaul, burning villas and enslaving the population. Franks descended the river valleys, their war bands swelling with each victory. In the east, Sassanid Persia pressed relentlessly against fortresses in Syria and Mesopotamia. King Shapur I humiliated 3 emperors in succession, capturing Valerian alive and forcing him to kneel as a human footstool. But the barbarians inflicted mere scratches compared to the cancer-eating Rome from within. The mint churned out coins with less silver than a kitchen spoon. What had once contained 90% precious metal now held barely 5%. People watched their savings evaporate as prices exploded. A bushel of grain that cost 1 denarius in the year 200 demanded 50 by 280. Soldiers mutinied when their pay purchased nothing but bread crusts and sour wine. Provincial governors declared independence rather than send taxes to a capital that changed hands monthly. In Gaul, Postumus established his own Gallic empire and minted coins bearing his likeness. Queen Zenobia of Palmyra carved out an eastern empire stretching from Syria to Egypt. The Tetricus family ruled Britain and northern Gaul as their personal kingdom. Rome controlled little beyond central Italy, and even that tenuously. The Senate cowered in their marble halls, powerless spectators to collapse. Aristocrats fled to their country estates, abandoning the political chaos of the capital. Trade routes that had carried Mediterranean wealth for centuries lay broken, infested with bandits and barbarian war parties. Cities that had thrived under the Pax Romana now huddled behind hastily built walls, their populations dwindling as residents fled to the countryside. Into this maelstrom stepped Diocles, a soldier's son from Dalmatia, whose calloused hands had never known silk or gold rings. Born in a military camp to a freedman father, he had risen through the ranks by competence rather than connections. Veterans knew him as a man who shared their rations and bled beside them in battle. When the Praetorian Guard murdered Emperor Numerianus in 284, the Danube legions proclaimed Diocles emperor. He took the name Diocletian and prepared to either save Rome or die trying. His first challenge came immediately. Carinus, Numerianus's brother, controlled the western armies and refused to yield power. The two forces met at the Battle of the Margus River the following year. The emperor's troops fought with desperate fury, knowing defeat meant crucifixion. As the battle raged, Carinus's own officers struck him down. They had grown weary of his cruelty and debauchery. Victory fell to the Dalmatian, not through superior tactics, but through his enemy's vices. Standing amid the corpse-strewn battlefield, the new ruler surveyed an empire hemorrhaging from 50 wounds. Barbarian tribes pressed every frontier. Provincial armies marched behind a dozen would-be emperors. The treasury lay empty, its bronze floors echoing with the footsteps of desperate clerks. Inflation ravaged what remained of the economy. The Praetorian Guard sold favor to the highest bidder. No single man could govern this chaos. The empire had grown too vast, too complex, too crisis-ridden for traditional rule. The emperor made a revolutionary decision that would reshape government forever. He would divide power among multiple rulers. The tetrarchy emerged from military necessity rather than political theory. The emperor appointed Maximian as Augustus of the West, while retaining Eastern command himself. Each Augustus then chose a Caesar as heir and deputy. The senior ruler selected Galerius. Maximian chose Constantius Chlorus. 4 rulers now governed what one emperor could no longer control. The system operated like a well-disciplined army. Each tetrarch commanded specific territories and legions. The Eastern Augustus ruled the wealthy provinces from Nicomedia, keeping watch on the Persian frontier. Maximian controlled Italy, Spain, and Africa from Milan. Constantius governed Gaul and Britain from Trier, facing Germanic threats across the Rhine. Galerius commanded the Balkans from Thessalonica, blocking barbarian incursions along the Danube. This division reflected harsh geographic realities. Messages between Rome and the Rhine frontier took months to travel. By the time news of a barbarian invasion reached the capital, entire provinces might lie in ruins. Local commanders needed authority to respond immediately to threats. The tetrarchy placed decision-makers where decisions mattered most. The senior ruler restructured the military with equal pragmatism. The old legionary system had failed against barbarian mobility and internal rebellion. He created 2 distinct forces, Limitanae and Comitatenses. The Limitanae, frontier troops, manned border fortifications and conducted local patrols. These soldier farmers lived permanently in frontier zones, their families and livelihoods tied to specific regions. They knew every hill, forest, and river crossing in their territory. Behind them stood the Comitatenses, mobile field armies ready to march wherever crisis erupted. These elite units moved rapidly between threatened sectors, reinforcing Limitanae or crushing rebellions. The emperor doubled the army's size from 300,000 to 600,000 men, but military costs consumed 75% of state revenue. Financing this expansion required ruthless efficiency. Tax collectors descended on provinces like locusts, demanding payment in gold, silver, grain, and livestock. The annona system replaced monetary taxation in many regions. Inhabitants paid directly in goods the army needed. Soldiers received rations rather than coins, protecting them from inflation's ravages. Yet the emperor's most ambitious reform targeted the economy's fundamental problem, runaway inflation. In the year 301, the government issued its edict on maximum prices, establishing fixed costs for everything from bread to silk, carpentry to prostitution. The edict listed over 1,000 items with death penalties for violations. The proclamation read like economic fantasy. A pound of beef cost 30 denarii, no more, no less. A skilled carpenter earned 50 denarii daily. A pair of boots cost 60 denarii. Those who charged higher prices faced execution. Those who refused to sell faced the same fate. Reality mocked these commands. Merchants withdrew goods from markets rather than sell at ruinous prices. Black markets flourished in every city. People bartered directly, abandoning currency altogether. The edict accelerated the economic collapse it sought to prevent. Within 2 years, the government quietly abandoned price controls, but the damage was done. Trust in currency never recovered. Religious persecution accompanied economic experimentation. the emperor blamed Christians for divine displeasure causing misfortunes. In 303, he launched the Great Persecution, the last and most systematic attempt to destroy Christianity through state violence. Edicts ordered Christian scriptures burned and churches demolished. Christian soldiers faced discharge from the army. Christian officials lost their positions. Those who refused to sacrifice to traditional gods faced imprisonment, torture, or death. In some provinces, governors organized mass executions, feeding Christians to wild beasts or burning them alive. The persecution revealed Christianity's growing strength. Despite centuries of intermittent suppression, the faith had penetrated every level of society. Christian soldiers served in the legions. Christian officials administered provinces. Christian merchants controlled vital trade networks. Christian intellectuals taught in prestigious schools. The emperor's attempts to restore traditional religion failed because Christianity offered what paganism could not: hope during catastrophe, community during chaos, and eternal meaning during temporal collapse. While cults demanded sacrifice to distant deities, Christian congregations provided food for the hungry, care for the sick, and burial for the dead. The emperor's administrative reforms proved more enduring than his religious policies. He tripled the number of provinces, reducing each governor's territory and power. This prevented provincial rebellions, but created enormous bureaucratic costs. Tens of thousands of officials now drew salaries from an already strained treasury. The new ruler established separate military and civilian hierarchies, ending the tradition of governors commanding troops. This reduced the risk of military coups, but slowed responses to crises. When barbarians attacked, civilian officials had to coordinate with military commanders rather than responding directly. The new system resembled an Oriental despotism more than the old principate. People prostrated themselves before government representatives. Elaborate court ceremonies emphasized the ruler's divine nature. Armed guards surrounded officials at all times. The emperor became a remote figure, visible only during carefully staged public appearances. These changes reflected deeper transformations in society. The old republican traditions had withered during 2 centuries of rule. People no longer participated meaningfully in government. The Senate had become a decorative assembly of frightened aristocrats. Political power flowed through military command and bureaucratic appointment, rather than election or popular acclaim. Provincial populations increasingly viewed themselves as subjects rather than participants. They owed taxes and military service to distant rulers, but received little protection or benefit in return. Local elites collaborated with administrators to maintain their privileges, while ordinary people bore crushing fiscal burdens. Economic stratification widened dramatically. Aristocratic landowners accumulated vast estates worked by dependent peasants. Independent farmers disappeared, unable to compete with slave-worked latifundia or pay oppressive taxes. Cities shrank as trade declined, and wealthy families retreated to fortified rural villas. Yet the emperor's system achieved its primary goal: stability. For 20 years, the tetrarchy prevented civil wars, repelled barbarian invasions, and maintained unity. Rival claimants could not challenge 4 rulers simultaneously. Barbarian tribes faced coordinated responses from multiple armies. Provincial rebellions confronted overwhelming resources. The emperor's greatest innovation was perhaps his most shocking: voluntary abdication. On May 1st, 305, the ruler announced his retirement from power. Standing before assembled dignitaries at Nicomedia, he removed the purple cloak and handed authority to his designated successors. Ancient sources record the stunned silence that followed this unprecedented act. Emperors died in battle, succumbed to disease, fell to assassins, or suffered deposition. They did not simply walk away from ultimate power. The voluntary abdication demonstrated genuine commitment to institutional stability over personal ambition. He forced his reluctant colleague, Maximian, to abdicate simultaneously, ensuring both senior tetrarchs retired together. Galerius and Constantius became the new Augusti, while Severus and Maximinus Dia received appointment as Caesars. The system had survived its first transition of power without bloodshed. The former ruler retired to his magnificent palace at Split on the Dalmatian coast. He spent his remaining years tending gardens and reflecting on governance. When former colleagues begged him to resume power during subsequent civil wars, he supposedly replied, "If you could see the vegetables I grow at Split, you would not urge me to give up the happiness of this place for the storms of life." His legacy was profoundly ambiguous. The Tetrarchy had ended 50 years of chaos and preserved unity. Administrative reforms strengthened frontier defenses and improved provincial governance. Economic policies, despite their failures, demonstrated determination to address systemic problems. Yet the emperor's solutions carried fatal seeds of future collapse. Dividing the empire between East and West created competing power centers that would eventually become independent states. Massive military expansion consumed resources desperately needed for infrastructure, education, and economic development. Bureaucratic growth strangled productivity while enriching officials at taxpayers' expense. The persecution of Christians alienated a growing segment of the population while failing to restore traditional religious unity. Economic controls demonstrated weakness rather than strength, encouraging further monetary collapse. Most dangerously, the enlarged army increasingly depended on barbarian recruits whose loyalties remained questionable. Standing in his garden at Split, watching vegetables grow in neat rows, the former ruler could not foresee how his reforms would ultimately destroy the empire he had saved. The division between East and West would become permanent. The bloated bureaucracy would crush economic vitality. The barbarian-filled army would turn against its masters. But in 305, those disasters lay hidden in an unknowable future. For the moment, Rome endured. The frontiers held. The cities functioned. People paid their taxes and worshipped their gods. The empire that had nearly perished during the 3rd century crisis lived to face new challenges in the 4th century. Yet careful observers might have noticed troubling signs. In the eastern provinces, wealth flowed toward Constantinople's future site. Germanic tribes pressed harder against Rhine and Danube defenses. Christian communities grew larger and more confident despite recent persecution. Most ominously, armies increasingly resembled barbarian warbands, their ranks filled with Germanic warriors fighting for gold rather than ideals. The marble facades gleamed as brightly as ever, but cracks spread through the foundation. The emperor had postponed the empire's collapse, not prevented it. The forces that would eventually destroy the Western territories were already gathering strength, waiting for their moment to strike. The vegetables in the garden at Split continued to grow, but the empire their former tender had stabilized began to wither. Barely 1 year after the peaceful transition of 305, the Tetrarchy collapsed into the very chaos it was designed to prevent. Constantius Chlorus died suddenly at York in 306 while campaigning against the Picts. His legions immediately proclaimed his son as Augustus, shattering the carefully constructed succession system. In the capital, the Praetorian Guard murdered Flavius Severus and elevated Maxentius, son of the retired Maximian, to the purple. Maximian himself emerged from forced retirement, reclaiming power in defiance of his former colleagues' wishes. Galerius appointed Licinius as a replacement Augustus, while Maximinus Dio refused subordination and declared himself equal to his supposed superiors. By 307, 6 men claimed the title of Augustus. The mathematical elegance of the tetrarchy dissolved into arithmetic chaos. Instead of preventing civil war, the system multiplied it 6-fold. The young son of Constantius proved the most ruthless and ambitious of the contenders. Unlike the other claimants who fought for traditional power, this general understood that the future belonged to whoever could forge new alliances and embrace radical change. While his rivals clung to the old gods and familiar methods, he gambled everything on a revolutionary vision that would transform civilization itself. The test came at the Milvian Bridge outside the capital in October 312. The challenger's army faced Maxentius across the muddy Tiber, outnumbered and far from home. Victory seemed impossible against an enemy fighting to defend his city with superior numbers and the advantage of prepared positions. But something extraordinary happened in the challenger's camp the night before battle. Whether through divine vision, political calculation, or desperate inspiration, the general ordered his soldiers to paint a new symbol on their shields, the Chi-Rho representing Christ's name in Greek letters. For the first time in 3 centuries, a major army would march under Christian banners against the traditional gods of their ancestors. The battle unfolded with shocking swiftness. Cavalry units shattered Maxentius's flanks while infantry pressed forward in disciplined formation. The defending forces, trapped between the attacking army and the river, broke in panic. Thousands drowned trying to flee across the Tiber. Maxentius himself perished when his horse stumbled on the crowded bridge, throwing him into the dark waters where his heavy armor dragged him to the bottom. The victor entered the capital not merely as another successful general, but as the champion of a persecuted faith that had survived 3 centuries of intermittent suppression. The psychological impact reverberated across the Mediterranean world. Christianity, which emperors had tried to destroy through fire and sword, had delivered victory to its protector. The new master of the West moved quickly to consolidate this religious revolution. In 313, he and Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance throughout their territories. Christians could worship openly, without fear of imprisonment or death. Their seized property was restored. Their churches could be rebuilt. Their clergy gained legal recognition and tax exemptions previously reserved for pagan priests. But the emperor went far beyond mere tolerance. He showered the church with gold, land, and political favor. Bishops received salaries from the state treasury, often exceeding those of provincial governors. Magnificent basilicas rose in every major city, funded by wealth confiscated from pagan temples. The ruler himself presided over theological disputes, using government power to enforce religious unity where persuasion failed. This transformation shattered traditional society's foundations. For 3 centuries, identity had been inseparable from worship of the ancestral gods. Jupiter, Mars, and Minerva had guided expansion from a collection of hills beside the Tiber to dominion over the Mediterranean world. Now their temples stood empty, while crowds flocked to hear Christian preachers proclaim the old deities to be demons, deserving destruction rather than veneration. Aristocratic families split between those who embraced the new faith for political advantage and those who clung to ancestral traditions at the cost of career advancement. The Senate, already reduced to ceremonial irrelevance, found itself divided by religious as well as political considerations. Provincial governors faced the delicate task of balancing Christian zeal with pagan resistance, often within the same cities and sometimes within the same families. The economic implications proved staggering. Christian churches, previously funded through voluntary contributions from persecuted believers, suddenly received massive state subsidies. Pagan temples lost their endowments as sacred treasures were melted down to finance Christian construction projects. Ancient priesthoods that had maintained civic festivals and public ceremonies for centuries found themselves unemployed and impoverished. Local communities experienced dramatic social upheaval. Traditional festivals honoring local gods were banned or transformed into Christian celebrations. Schools that had taught classical literature and philosophy for generations faced pressure to emphasize Christian doctrine instead. Artisans who had crafted religious statues and temple decorations discovered their skills were no longer wanted or actively condemned as idolatrous. The consequences proved even more significant. The emperor's victory demonstrated that Christian soldiers fought as fiercely as pagan ones, perhaps more so, believing they served God as well as their earthly commander. This opened vast new recruiting grounds among populations previously excluded from service. Tribes along the frontier, many already influenced by Arian Christianity, could now serve without abandoning their faith entirely. Yet the most momentous decision came in 324, when the emperor defeated Licinius in the final civil war and claimed sole rule over both East and West. Standing victorious at Chrysopolis, he gazed across the Bosphorus at the ancient Greek city of Byzantium and envisioned something unprecedented, a new capital to rival the old one. The site possessed every strategic advantage geography could provide. The Golden Horn offered perfect harbour facilities for both commercial and naval fleets capable of accommodating the largest grain ships from Egypt. The Bosphorus controlled passage between Europe and Asia, Black Sea and Mediterranean, choking the most vital trade route in the ancient world. 7 hills echoed the legendary topography of the old capital. Most importantly, this location lay 800 miles closer to the real centers of wealth and power in Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia. Construction began immediately, with maniacal intensity that drained resources from across the eastern provinces. Workers labored in shifts around the clock, stripping marble from temples across the Greek world to adorn the new metropolis. The emperor established a senate with 300 members, drawn from Eastern aristocrats, built forums and basilicas that rivaled anything in the West, constructed aqueducts and cisterns capable of supplying 1 million inhabitants, and imported grain distributions to feed a rapidly growing population. The scale of the project staggered contemporary observers. The Hippodrome seated 100,000 spectators, larger than any structure in the old capital. The great palace complex covered several square miles, with throne rooms, reception halls, private apartments, churches, and gardens that employed thousands of servants and officials. Harbour facilities could accommodate 800 vessels simultaneously, making the city the Mediterranean's largest port almost overnight. Most symbolically, the emperor erected no temples to the traditional gods. This would be a Christian city from its foundation. The Hagia Irene and other early churches received endowments that exceeded the resources of entire provinces. Christian symbols adorned public buildings, coins, and official documents. For the first time in history, a major city would be explicitly Christian rather than merely tolerant of Christian worship. When the emperor dedicated his creation on May 11th, 330, he called it New Capital. But everyone knew it as the city bearing his name. The ceremony mixed Christian prayers with traditional pageantry, blessing a capital that would endure for over 1,000 years after the original seat of power fell to barbarians. The economic implications dwarfed even the religious significance. Egypt's grain ships, which had fed the old capital for 3 centuries, now sailed northward to the Bosphorus. Tax revenues from the richest provinces flowed into the new treasury rather than the old coffers. The finest artisans, scholars, and administrators relocated eastward, drawn by favor and opportunity unavailable in the declining West. The prefect of Egypt, who had once been responsible for feeding 1 million residents of the original capital, now diverted the grain fleet to supply the growing population along the Bosphorus. Syrian merchants who had maintained offices throughout the Mediterranean concentrated their activities in the new commercial hub. Anatolian landowners discovered they could reach the seat of power in days rather than months, giving them decisive advantages in legal disputes and political maneuvering. Within a generation, the balance of power shifted decisively. The new capital commanded Egyptian grain, Syrian trade routes, and Anatolian recruiting grounds. Its harbour filled with merchant ships carrying silk from China, spices from India, ivory from Africa, and furs from the Black Sea steppes. The city's population exploded from perhaps 50,000 to over 500,000, while the old capital's residents fled to the countryside or migrated eastward seeking opportunity. This transformation occurred precisely when the West faced mounting pressures along every frontier. Frankish and Alemannic tribes, pushed by Hun expansion in the distant steppes, pressed harder against Rhine and Danube defences. The Alemanni crossed into Alsace and established permanent settlements that no amount of diplomatic pressure could dislodge. Frankish war bands raided deep into Gaul, some reaching the Pyrenees before Roman forces could respond effectively. Saxon pirates controlled the North Sea, their shallow draft vessels appearing suddenly along the British and Gallic coasts to burn villas and carry off slaves. The construction of massive coastal fortifications along the British shore, the Saxon shore forts, consumed enormous resources while providing only limited protection. Each fort required permanent garrisons drawn from armies, already stretched beyond their limits by competing demands. The Western armies lacked the resources to respond effectively to these multiplying threats. Egypt's wealth now funded Eastern legions rather than Western ones. The best recruitment regions lay under barbarian control or within the new capital's sphere of influence. Gallic recruiting grounds, devastated by repeated invasions, could no longer supply the manpower needed for effective frontier defense. By 335, the Western forces consisted increasingly of barbarian federates. Entire tribes granted land in exchange for service. These foederati arrangements seemed practical solutions to immediate problems. Barbarian warriors possessed the mobility and ferocity needed to counter tribal raids, while costing less than regular legions, since they supported themselves through agricultural settlements rather than monetary payments. The Visigoths, settled in southwestern Gaul, provided effective cavalry forces for operations against Frankish raiders. Frankish federates in the Rhineland knew the terrain and enemy tactics better than any foreign soldiers could. Saxon auxiliaries in Britain understood naval warfare against their own kinsmen. These arrangements appeared to solve recruitment problems while securing frontier regions through the presence of loyal allied populations. Yet the system contained fatal contradictions that would eventually destroy Western authority entirely. Barbarian soldiers served specific commanders rather than abstract governmental authority. Their loyalties belonged to war leaders who provided land, plunder, and protection, rather than to distant emperors who offered only promises of future rewards. When conflicts arose between tribal interests and policy, the federates inevitably chose their own people over their supposed masters. The religious settlement created similar problems throughout society. The emperor's sons, the younger rulers who inherited divided territories, governed realms where Christianity was dominant but not universal, unified but not uniform. Arian Christians, who denied Christ's full divinity, controlled much of the Eastern Church and many tribal groups. Orthodox believers, who affirmed the Trinity, dominated in the West but faced persistent theological challenges from rivals who enjoyed barbarian support. The Council of Nicaea in 325 had attempted to resolve these disputes through decree, but theological differences proved more stubborn than political ones. Bishops who accepted the Nicene Creed in public continued to preach Arian doctrine in private to congregations that preferred familiar interpretations. Federate tribes nominally embraced Orthodox Christianity while maintaining Arian beliefs inherited from their Gothic teachers and preserved through tribal religious traditions. The emperor's religious unity remained as fragile as his political authority, dependent on continuous enforcement rather than genuine conviction. Arian bishops maintained extensive correspondence networks that crossed political boundaries, coordinating resistance to orthodox policies. Tribal chieftains used religious differences to justify political independence from central control. The faith that was supposed to unify the realm instead provided another source of division and conflict. The ruler died in 337 while preparing another Persian campaign, leaving 3 sons to divide territories among themselves according to a succession plan that ignored the lessons of previous fraternal conflicts. The inevitable brotherly struggle erupted within 3 years, when the eldest attacked the youngest in northern Italy, but died in the resulting battle. The surviving brother ruled the West until his own generals murdered him in 350 during yet another coup. The eastern heir survived by eliminating rivals systematically, but his realm faced constant pressure from Persian armies and internal religious strife. These civil wars accelerated every destructive trend the transformation had initiated. Barbarian federates, whose services became essential during internecine conflicts, demanded greater autonomy and more extensive territories as payment for their support. Regional commanders, cut off from central support during fratricidal fighting, made independent accommodations with tribal groups. Provincial populations, exhausted by taxation and recruitment demands, welcomed barbarian rule as relief from exploitation. The Alemannic federates in Gaul began treating their granted territories as independent kingdoms rather than temporary settlements. Frankish allies along the Rhine established hereditary chieftaincies that ignored governmental authority. Saxon auxiliaries in Britain demanded permanent territorial grants rather than temporary billeting arrangements. Each concession established precedents that encouraged further demands from other tribal groups. The economic consequences proved equally devastating for Western regions. Egypt's grain, Syria's trade revenues, and Anatolia's recruits continued flowing eastward, while Western territories struggled with declining populations and collapsing infrastructure. Roads that had carried Mediterranean commerce for centuries crumbled under weather and disuse as maintenance funds were diverted to more pressing needs. Urban centers that had thrived for generations emptied as residents fled to fortified rural estates or barbarian-controlled territories where taxes were lower and security was better. Trier, once a thriving capital, lost half its population within 20 years. Milan's workshops closed as artisans migrated eastward or abandoned their trades entirely. Even the old capital itself shrank dramatically as aristocratic families relocated to safer regions. The transformation reached a tipping point during this period of fraternal warfare. By 340, barbarian warriors constituted nearly half of all Western forces, their loyalty purchased through territorial grants that reduced actual governmental control. Regular legions, undermanned and demoralized, proved incapable of sustained campaigning without federate support that came with increasing political demands. The old hierarchy collapsed as tribal chiefs gained effective command over mixed forces that owed primary allegiance to their immediate commanders rather than distant authority. Provincial governors found themselves negotiating with barbarian allies rather than commanding them, while tribal leaders made policy decisions that affected entire regions without consulting governmental officials. These changes fundamentally altered the nature of authority itself throughout the Western territories. Previous emperors had ruled through law, administered by officials, enforced by legions answerable to the state. The 4th century West increasingly resembled a confederation of autonomous regions, held together by personal loyalties to successful war leaders rather than institutional obligations to governmental structures. Christianity provided the only unifying force strong enough to transcend tribal and regional divisions. But even this bond proved inadequate to maintain political unity in practice. Arian and Orthodox communities competed for favor, while barbarian tribes interpreted Christian doctrine through their own cultural lenses that emphasized warrior virtues over governmental obedience. The religion that had promised to unite the realm instead became another source of division and competition. The shift in economic gravity toward the new Eastern capital had implications far beyond mere administrative convenience or ceremonial preference. The Eastern city attracted not only wealth, but also talent, ambition, and innovation from across the Mediterranean world. The West's ablest administrators, generals, and intellectuals sought their fortunes where favor and opportunity beckoned most brightly. Provincial families that had served for generations relocated to regions where their skills commanded respect and reward, rather than suspicion and exploitation. The senatorial class, traditionally centered in the old capital, established new branches in the East where political participation remained meaningful rather than merely ceremonial. Even merchants and artisans discovered that Eastern markets offered better prospects than declining Western cities. This brain drain left the West increasingly dependent on barbarian leadership and tribal solutions to governmental problems. The cultural synthesis that had sustained civilization for 4 centuries began to fragment as traditions mixed with tribal customs, Christian theology blended with barbarian folklore, and law accommodated practices that contradicted fundamental principles. By the time the dynasty ended, in 363, with Julian's death in Persia, the pattern was irreversible and clearly visible to contemporary observers. The East would continue evolving into the Byzantine realm, a Christian monarchy that blended law with Greek culture and Oriental despotism. The West would fragment into barbarian kingdoms that preserved names while abandoning governmental substance. The transformation, begun by a soldier's vision, before a battle had reshaped civilization itself throughout the Mediterranean world. But it had also ensured that the classical world of Caesar and Augustus, Trajan and Hadrian would survive only in memory and ruins. The living entity had moved eastward, leaving its western shell to crumble under pressures it no longer possessed the strength to resist or the resources to overcome. The eastern capital gleamed with marble and gold, while the west bled from 1,000 wounds. As the dynasty of the great Christian emperor crumbled into fraternal warfare, Germanic tribes sensed opportunity along every frontier. What had begun as isolated raids evolved into systematic invasion, conquest, and permanent settlement on lands that had known peace for 3 centuries. The Alemanni struck first and hardest. These fierce warriors, whose name meant all men, had coalesced from dozens of smaller tribes into a confederation capable of fielding 40,000 warriors. Their king, Chenodomar, commanded respect from the Rhine to the Danube via tactical brilliance and savage ruthlessness that terrified even veteran legionaries. In 356, Chenodomar's forces crossed the Rhine in strength near Strasbourg, overwhelming the Limitani fortifications that should have contained them. The enemy army moved with shocking speed across Alsace, burning every villa and fortress in their path. Refugees fled southward, carrying tales of systematic destruction. Entire towns reduced to ash, their populations slaughtered or enslaved. Caesar Flavius Claudius Julianus, nephew of the Eastern ruler and commander of Gallic forces, responded with an army of 13,000 men. Contemporary sources describe the emperor's nephew as a slight figure, more comfortable with books than battlefields, yet possessed of surprising strategic insight. At Strasbourg, he faced an enemy force 3 times larger than his own, deployed on ground of their choosing. The battle unfolded like a nightmare for the defenders. Alemannic warriors charged in dense formations, their iron spears and long swords cutting across hastily formed shield walls. For hours, the outcome remained uncertain as the Caesar's troops gave ground slowly, trading space for time while their commander sought an opening. Victory came via desperate innovation rather than superior numbers. The young general ordered his cavalry to feign retreat, drawing the Alemannic warriors into pursuit across marshy ground where their heavy equipment became a liability. When the enemy found themselves trapped in the mud, reformed legions struck from both flanks while archers poured arrows into the confused mass. Chenodomar fell in the slaughter that followed, but his death solved nothing. The Alemannic Confederation simply elevated new leaders and continued their pressure against weakening frontiers. Within 5 years, these tribes had established permanent settlements along the upper Rhine valley, their fortified villages becoming bases for further expansion southward. The Frankish threat proved even more insidious than direct Alemannic assault. Instead of massive invasions, Frankish warbands infiltrated beyond the lower Rhine in small groups, avoiding major confrontations while systematically occupying territory using stealth and intimidation. Their tactics resembled organized banditry more than traditional warfare, but the cumulative effect devastated entire regions. Frankish raiders appeared suddenly along the Belgian coast, their shallow draft boats emerging from river mouths to strike isolated settlements before vanishing into the interior marshlands. They established hidden camps in the Ardennes forests, launching attacks against passing merchants and military patrols. Survivors reported war bands that seemed to materialize from nowhere, strike with lightning speed, then disappear before reinforcements could arrive. The economic damage exceeded the human cost. Trade routes that had carried British tin, Spanish silver, and African ivory for centuries became too dangerous for merchant caravans. The great commercial centers of Gaul, Reims, Trier, and Cologne saw their markets shrivel as traders sought safer paths across other regions. Tax revenues collapsed as productive regions fell under tribal control or suffered such devastation that collection became impossible. The emperor's nephew's response demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of effective leadership during this crisis period. When he assumed control in Gaul during 355, the province verged on complete collapse. Germanic tribes controlled vast regions, cities lay in ruins, and the surviving population had lost faith in their ability to defend them. The young Caesar proved himself a master of frontier warfare by means of campaigns that combined traditional tactics with innovative strategies adapted to enemy methods. He rebuilt the Rhine fortifications with improved designs that featured multiple defensive lines and better communication systems. His engineers constructed new types of siege engines, specifically designed to reduce tribal fortresses quickly and efficiently. Most importantly, the Caesar understood that military success required economic recovery. He reformed the taxation system to reduce burdens on devastated regions, while providing incentives for agricultural restoration. His administrators worked to rebuild trade networks by guaranteeing safe passage for merchants and establishing military escorts for valuable cargoes. The results seemed miraculous to contemporary observers. Within 3 years, the general had cleared most tribal forces from Gallic lands and restored a semblance of normal life to regions that had been written off as lost. His victories at Strasbourg and Cologne became legendary among soldiers who had grown accustomed to defeat and retreat. Yet these successes masked deeper problems that no amount of tactical brilliance could solve. The general's campaigns required enormous resources drawn from other frontiers, weakening defences along the Danube and British coasts. His reformed taxation system, while more efficient than its predecessor, still imposed crushing burdens on populations struggling to recover from years of devastation. Most critically, these victories depended heavily on federate allies, whose loyalty remained conditional on continued success and generous rewards. Frankish allies who fought against their Alemannic cousins demanded territorial concessions that reduced actual governmental control. Saxon auxiliaries who helped clear the Rhine demanded similar privileges in Britain. The Persian disaster of 363 exposed these underlying weaknesses with catastrophic clarity. Julian, now elevated to sole ruler after his cousin's death, launched an ambitious campaign to restore eastern frontiers that had been neglected during Western crisis. His army penetrated deep into Mesopotamia, captured several major fortresses, and seemed poised to inflict decisive defeat on the Sassanid monarchy. But Persian resistance proved far more effective than anticipated. King Shapur II had learned from previous defeats, adopting defensive strategies that drew invaders deep into hostile territory before cutting their supply lines. Julian's forces found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, and running short of provisions in country where every inhabitant was an enemy. The emperor died during a confused night action, struck down by a spear that may have come from Persian hands or his own disaffected soldiers. His death transformed a difficult campaign into complete disaster. The retreating army lost 30,000 men to enemy action, disease, and desertion before reaching friendly ground. The new ruler, Jovian, purchased safe passage by surrendering 5 provinces and agreeing to humiliating tribute payments. This catastrophe reverberated across the western regions with devastating effect. The cream of the mobile field army, units that had taken decades to train and equip, lay buried in Mesopotamian sand. The federates who had provided crucial support for frontier defense saw clear evidence that their supposed masters could not protect even themselves, much less their allies. Enemy pressure intensified immediately. The Alemanni, who had remained quiet during the Persian expedition, renewed their attacks with unprecedented ferocity. Frankish war bands crossed the Rhine in massive numbers, no longer content with isolated raids but seeking permanent conquest. Saxon pirates launched coordinated assaults against British coastal defences that had been stripped of troops for eastern service. The governmental response revealed how thoroughly the crisis had undermined traditional authority structures. Valentinian I, who assumed Western rule in 364, faced impossible choices with inadequate resources. He could defend Gaul by weakening Britain, or protect the Rhine by abandoning the Danube, but he lacked the manpower to secure all frontiers simultaneously. Valentinian chose to prioritize the Rhine frontier, reasoning that Gallic regions provided the economic foundation for any effective defense. This decision condemned Britain to increasing isolation and self-reliance that would eventually lead to complete separation from continental authority. British commanders, left without reinforcements or supplies, made their own accommodations with Saxon raiders and indigenous rebellions. The emperor's Danubian strategy proved equally problematic. Valentinian established his capital at Trier to remain close to the most threatened regions, but this meant governing vast areas by means of subordinates whose loyalty often depended more on local support than central authority. Provincial governors became virtual warlords, maintaining power using personal relationships with tribal allies rather than institutional commands. The Quadi and Marcomanni, Germanic tribes beyond the Danube, sensed weakness and opportunity in this fragmented authority. In 374, they launched coordinated invasions that penetrated deep into Pannonia and Noricum, destroying settlements and carrying off thousands of captives. The scale of devastation exceeded anything seen since the darkest days of the 3rd century crisis. Valentinian's response demonstrated both his personal courage and the systemic problems facing Western leadership. The emperor marched personally to the Danube frontier, determined to restore order by means of decisive action that had once characterized effective governance. He rebuilt fortifications, reorganized supply systems, and prepared for the kind of campaign that had brought the Caesar success in Gaul. But the stress of continuous crisis had taken its toll on the aging ruler. During negotiations with Quadi envoys at Bregetio in 375, Valentinian suffered a massive stroke that killed him instantly. Contemporary sources describe the emperor collapsing in mid-sentence while denouncing enemy perfidy, his face purpling with rage as life left his body. His death created the succession crisis that would prove fatal to Western stability. Valentinian left 2 sons, Gratian, a capable 16-year-old who inherited Gaul and Britain, and Valentinian II, a 4-year-old child who supposedly ruled Italy, Pannonia, and Africa under the regency of his Arian mother, Justina. This division of authority between a teenager and an infant, overseen by a woman whose religious beliefs alienated Orthodox Christians, invited disaster. Germanic tribes that had feared Valentinian's wrath saw opportunity in governmental paralysis. Regional commanders who had submitted to the father's authority questioned the son's legitimacy. Religious factions that had remained quiet during effective rule erupted into open conflict. The Alemannic response came swiftly and devastatingly. In late 375, massive warbands crossed the frozen Rhine at multiple points, spreading destruction along Gaul, while governmental forces struggled to coordinate responses between competing authorities. The enemy had learned from previous defeats, avoiding major battles, while systematically occupying lands using coordinated small unit actions. These tactics proved devastatingly effective against a fragmented defense. Gratian's forces could not be everywhere at once, and local commanders lacked authority to coordinate regional responses. Individual fortresses fell one by one as their isolated garrisons were overwhelmed by superior numbers. Entire districts submitted to tribal rule rather than face destruction. The economic consequences accelerated every destructive trend of the previous decades. Gallic tax revenues, already reduced by years of warfare, collapsed entirely in affected regions. The skilled craftsmen and educated administrators who had maintained civilization's infrastructure fled southward or crossed the Channel to Britain. Archaeological evidence from this period shows dramatic population decline in former urban centres. Agricultural production suffered equally severe disruption. The villa system that had provided Gaul's agricultural surplus for 3 centuries crumbled as landowners abandoned their estates or submitted to tribal protection. Free peasants fled to fortified settlements or accepted unfree status under new masters rather than face starvation or slaughter. The breakdown extended beyond mere economic disruption to fundamental alterations in social structure and cultural identity. Latin, which had been the language of law, administration, and education across Gaul, gave way to Germanic dialects in occupied regions. Traditional legal systems collapsed as tribal customs replaced established jurisprudence. Religious life underwent equally dramatic transformation. Many Gallic Christians, faced with Arian rulers, adapted their beliefs to maintain some semblance of familiar worship. Others fled to regions still under Orthodox control, carrying tales of persecution and apostasy that inflamed religious tensions across the remaining lands. The federate system, which had seemed like an innovative solution to recruitment problems, revealed its fatal contradictions during this crisis period. Frankish allies, who had fought effectively against Alemannic enemies, proved reluctant to combat their own kinsmen when tribal loyalties conflicted with governmental obligations. Saxon auxiliaries demanded ever greater autonomy as payment for their continued service. These tribal troops possessed local knowledge and fighting skills that governmental forces lacked, making them indispensable for effective frontier defense. Yet their very indispensability gave them leverage to demand concessions that undermined the authority they supposedly served. Each territorial grant, each legal exemption, each recognition of tribal customs established precedents that encouraged further demands. The cumulative effect transformed vast regions from governmental lands into tribal kingdoms that maintained nominal allegiance while exercising practical independence. The Frankish federates in Toxandria governed their areas according to tribal law, collected their own taxes, and maintained their own forces. Alemannic settlers in Alsace acknowledged governmental authority only when it suited their immediate interests. By 376, the western regions bore little resemblance to the unified province that had emerged from Diocletian's reforms. Instead of a single authority commanding obedient subjects, a patchwork of competing powers struggled for dominance over a devastated landscape. Governmental control extended only as far as force could reach, and force depended increasingly on allies whose loyalty could not be assumed. The administrative apparatus that had once managed the complexities of continental governance from Britain to Africa had fragmented into regional hierarchies that answered to local strongmen rather than distant emperors. Provincial governors ruled by means of accommodation, with tribal chiefs rather than enforcement of central policy. Even bishops found themselves negotiating with Arian rulers whose protection they needed for their congregation's survival. Cultural synthesis that had sustained civilization for centuries accelerated toward complete breakdown. The educational system that had produced administrators, lawyers, and intellectuals collapsed as schools closed for lack of students and funding. Libraries that had preserved classical learning for generations were abandoned or destroyed as their communities fled or submitted to illiterate conquerors. Yet perhaps most ominously, the crisis had demonstrated that tribal methods were superior to traditional tactics under frontier conditions. Germanic warriors possessed mobility, local knowledge, and tactical flexibility that regular legions could not match. Their organization provided unit cohesion that survived defeats and adapted quickly to changing circumstances. This revolution had implications far beyond immediate tactical considerations. If tribal forces were more effective than governmental armies, if allied warriors were more reliable than recruited soldiers, if enemy settlement was more efficient than direct administration, then what practical arguments remained for maintaining traditional authority structures? The question would soon receive its answer in the most catastrophic defeat in centuries, a disaster that would shatter forever the myth of invincibility and open the floodgates for the final deluge that would drown the western regions in blood and chaos. The answer came thundering across the steppes of Ukraine in the form of squat horsemen whose very appearance struck terror into hardened warriors. The Huns had arrived in Europe, and their coming would unleash powers that would reshape the continent forever. These nomadic riders bore little resemblance to any enemy the civilized world had previously encountered. Chinese sources described them as masters of mounted archery, who could loose arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. They lived entirely on horseback, sleeping in their saddles and eating raw meat softened under their thighs during long rides. Their faces, scarred by ritual cutting in childhood, appeared barely human to those who first witnessed their approach. Yet the Huns possessed capabilities that transcended their barbarous appearance. Their composite bows could pierce armor at ranges that left infantry helpless. Their ponies, though small and ugly, possessed endurance that allowed sustained campaigns across vast distances. Most critically, they fought with coordination and discipline that suggested sophisticated command structures hidden beneath their primitive facade. When these terrible horsemen descended upon the Tuvingi and Grotungi kingdoms north of the Danube in 375, they encountered civilizations that had flourished for 2 centuries in relative peace. King Ermanaric's Grotungi controlled territories stretching from the Dniester to the Don, their prosperity built on agriculture, trade, and tribute from subject peoples. The Tuvingi dominated the region between the Dniester and Danube, their settlements dotting river valleys that had known no warfare for generations. Both peoples had adopted Christianity, developed written laws, and established diplomatic relations with Constantinople. Their warriors served as federates in various armies. Their merchants traded throughout the Mediterranean. Their nobles sent their sons to receive classical educations in eastern cities. They represented the success of cultural synthesis between Germanic tradition and Greco-Roman civilization. The Hun onslaught shattered this achievement within months. Ermanaric's vast kingdom collapsed so completely that later chroniclers could barely piece together the sequence of events. The aged king, faced with total defeat, committed suicide rather than submit to nomadic overlords. His people scattered like leaves before a hurricane, some fleeing westward, others accepting Hun domination, still others disappearing entirely from historical record. The Tuvingi faced a more terrible choice. Their lands lay directly in the path of Hun expansion, offering no possibility of resistance against an enemy whose mobility made traditional defensive tactics useless. King Athanaric attempted to organize resistance behind earthwork fortifications, but Hun cavalry simply bypassed his positions to devastate the countryside beyond. By early 376, perhaps 200,000 Tervini, men, women, children, and elderly, had gathered along the Danube's northern bank. They came not as conquerors, but as refugees, carrying their portable possessions and driving their livestock before them like a migration of biblical proportions. Their leaders sent desperate embassies across the river, begging for sanctuary within Constantinople's sphere of control. Emperor Valens faced an unprecedented decision at his capital in Antioch. No previous ruler had confronted a refugee crisis of this magnitude. The Tuvingi petitioners offered to serve as federates in exchange for land grants, but their numbers dwarfed any previous settlement. 200,000 people represented a significant percentage of the realm's total population, enough to populate entire provinces or supplied dozens of units. The emperor's advisors split into competing factions. General Sebastian argued for rejection, warning that Tervingi settlement would create an autonomous state within the realm's borders. Prefect Modares, himself of Tervingi ancestry, advocated acceptance, emphasizing the potential of so many potential recruits. Finance ministers calculated the tax revenues that Tervingi farmers might generate versus the costs of rejecting them and facing continued frontier warfare. Valens ultimately chose acceptance, swayed by visions of Tervini warriors filling depleted army ranks and Tervini taxpayers contributing to strained finances. In late 376, he granted the refugees permission to cross the Danube and settle in Thrace, subject to disarmament and dispersal throughout the province to prevent concentrated resistance. The crossing began in early autumn, as families loaded their possessions onto rafts, boats, and improvised ferries. The Danube ran high from seasonal rains, making the operation dangerous even under ideal conditions. Entire families drowned when overloaded vessels capsized in the swift current. Others were swept downstream when makeshift craft broke apart in midstream. Those who reached the southern bank faced conditions that mocked official promises. Officials assigned to manage the resettlement had received no advance warning, no additional supplies, no extra personnel. They confronted 200,000 hungry, exhausted refugees, with resources adequate for perhaps 20,000 settlers. Chaos was inevitable. The Tervingi found themselves penned into overcrowded camps where sanitation quickly became impossible and food supplies ran critically short. Administrators, overwhelmed by the scale of their responsibilities, resorted to increasingly desperate expedients. They confiscated weapons as promised, but provided no alternative means of livelihood. They separated families to prevent tribal organization, but created conditions ripe for disease and starvation. Worse yet, local officials saw opportunity for personal enrichment in refugee desperation. Lupicinus, the commander of Thrace, began selling food to starving people at extortionate prices. Some Tervini traded their children into slavery to obtain bread for their remaining family members. Others surrendered ancestral treasures for scraps of meat unfit for human consumption. The breaking point came in early 377 when Lupicinus invited Tervingi leaders to a feast at Adrianople, supposedly to negotiate improved conditions. The banquet was a trap. While the chieftains dined with their host, his soldiers attempted to massacre their retainers, waiting outside the hall. The attack failed when guards fought back with improvised weapons, but the message was clear. The government intended genocide rather than accommodation. Fritigan, the most influential leader, escaped the ambush and immediately began organizing armed resistance. His message spread through the refugee camps like wildfire. The administration had broken its promises, murdered their kinsmen, and reduced their people to slavery. Only through warfare could the Tervini secure the safety and dignity they had been promised. The subsequent uprising caught governmental troops completely unprepared. The refugees possessed no weapons heavier than farming tools and kitchen knives, but their desperation transformed household implements into instruments of war. They overwhelmed isolated guard posts through sheer numbers, seized weapons from defeated enemies, and began coordinating attacks against larger targets. Within weeks, Fritigan commanded a formidable host of warriors, armed with captured equipment and burning for revenge against their oppressors. The refugee camps had become recruitment centers for an army that combined traditional Germanic fighting spirit with intimate knowledge of Roman methods, learned through decades of federal service. Local governmental troops proved incapable of containing this explosion of violence. The Limitani garrisons had been designed to repel external invasions, not suppress massive internal rebellions. They found themselves outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and fighting an enemy that appeared everywhere and nowhere, striking suddenly before melting back into the civilian population. Valens received news of the revolt while campaigning against Persia, where renewed warfare threatened the eastern frontiers that had been his primary concern. The emperor faced an agonizing choice: continue the Persian war that might restore eastern security, or return to deal with the crisis that threatened the realm's European heartland. He chose to conclude a hasty peace with Persia, accepting unfavorable terms to free his army for redeployment against the rebels. This decision reflected both the gravity of the threat and the emperor's fundamental misunderstanding of what he faced. Valens still thought in terms of suppressing a rebellion rather than confronting a full-scale migration of peoples seeking permanent homes. The emperor's return to Constantinople in late 377 revealed the magnitude of the crisis. Tevini units controlled much of Thrace, their raiding parties reaching almost to the capital's suburbs. They had been joined by other disaffected groups, Alans, Huns, and various Germanic tribes, who saw opportunity in governmental weakness. What had begun as a refugee crisis had evolved into a general confederation, seeking to carve independent territories from the realm's lands. Valens spent the winter of 377 to 378 rebuilding his army and preparing for what he envisioned as a decisive campaign to crush the resistance once and for all. His host included the best units from the eastern field armies, supplemented by hastily recruited federates and militia levies from Anatolia and Syria. Arab auxiliaries brought their knowledge of desert warfare, while Armenian cavalry provided mobile striking power. Yet the emperor made a critical error in his strategic planning. Convinced that rebel strength came from their ability to concentrate rapidly, he decided to seek immediate battle rather than employ the patient siege warfare that might have starved the insurgents into submission. This decision played directly into Tervingi advantages, while negating governmental superiority in siege equipment and logistics. The two armies converged near Adrianople in early August 378. Valens commanded perhaps 30,000 men, including some of the finest units in the eastern establishment. His host included the heavy cavalry Scholae Palatinae, elite infantry regiments with decades of campaign experience, and auxiliary units from across the eastern territories. By any reasonable calculation, this army should have crushed the rebels decisively. Fritigern fielded a slightly smaller host, but one that possessed crucial advantages in motivation and terrain knowledge. His warriors fought for their family's survival rather than distant glory, making them willing to accept casualties that would break less committed troops. More importantly, they had spent months learning Thracian geography, while their enemies approached unfamiliar territory with outdated maps and unreliable guides. The battle began with a series of skirmishes as both armies maneuvered for advantageous positions. Valens, eager for decisive results, pressed forward aggressively despite receiving reports of additional Tervingi units moving to join Fritigern. The emperor's commanders urged caution, suggesting they wait for reinforcements from the Western army, but Valens feared that delay would allow the rebels to escape rather than face destruction. This impatience proved fatal. As the governmental army deployed for battle on the afternoon of August 9th, Tervingi cavalry that had been foraging in distant areas suddenly appeared on the battlefield. These mounted warriors struck the right flank just as Valens launched his main assault against the wagon fort, creating simultaneous crises that overwhelmed command capabilities. The wagon fort, a circular arrangement of wheeled vehicles that served as both camp and fortress, initially held firm against attacks. Legionary infantry, fighting with disciplined ferocity, actually broke through the outer defenses and seemed poised to achieve victory. But the sudden appearance of mounted Tervingi transformed triumph into catastrophe within minutes. The horsemen swept around the flanks like a scythe through wheat, rolling up units that had no time to adjust their formations. Government cavalry, caught between the wagon fort and the attacking riders, found themselves trapped in a deadly vice with no room to maneuver. The entire right wing collapsed as units fled or surrendered rather than face annihilation. Valens himself died in the melee, though the exact circumstances of his death remain disputed. Some sources claim he fell fighting heroically in the front ranks. Others suggest he was struck down while attempting to rally his broken troops. His body was never recovered, buried under the thousands of soldiers who perished in the slaughter that followed. The casualties staggered contemporary observers. Perhaps 20,000 governmental troops died at Adrianople, including many of the Eastern Army's most experienced officers and elite units. Entire regiments disappeared from records, their eagles captured and their survivors scattered. The flower of Eastern might lay rotting under the Thracian sun, while Tervingi warriors stripped armor from corpses and celebrated their incredible victory. News of the disaster reached Constantinople 3 days later, carried by exhausted survivors who painted apocalyptic pictures of defeat. The city erupted in panic as residents prepared for siege, while government officials struggled to maintain order amid rumors of complete collapse. For the first time in over a century, enemy troops seemed capable of capturing the capital itself. Yet Fritigern proved more strategic than his victory might have suggested. Rather than attempt immediate assault on Constantinople's massive fortifications, he led his people westward into territories where resistance would be lighter and plunder more abundant. This decision reflected Tervingi limitations as much as wisdom. They lacked siege equipment adequate for attacking major fortified cities, and their strength lay in mobility rather than positional warfare. The withdrawal provided desperately needed breathing space for governmental recovery, but it also demonstrated how thoroughly Adrianople had altered the strategic balance. Rebel troops could now move freely through the realm's territories, besieging cities and devastating countryside, while organized resistance remained sporadic and ineffective. Gratian, the young Western emperor, rushed eastward with reinforcements, but his army moved too slowly to affect the immediate crisis. By the time Western units reached Thrace, the rebels had established control over vast areas and begun attracting additional allies drawn by the prospect of easy victories over demoralized opposition. The Senate in Rome recalled Theodosius from retirement in Spain, elevating him to Eastern rule in hopes that his reputation could restore order where others had failed. The new emperor faced an impossible situation. His army was shattered, his treasury was empty, his territories were occupied by victorious enemies, and his prestige was non-existent among the very people he needed to defeat or co-opt. Theodosius adopted a strategy that combined action with diplomatic accommodation. He rebuilt governmental units slowly, avoiding major battles while conducting limited operations designed to demonstrate continued presence. Simultaneously, he opened negotiations with Tervingi leaders, offering territorial concessions and federal status in exchange for service against other groups. This approach eventually achieved a precarious stability, but at enormous cost. The Tervingi received massive land grants in Thrace and the Balkans, establishing what amounted to an autonomous kingdom within the realm's borders. They maintained their own organization, legal system, and religious practices, while providing troops for campaigns on terms they themselves dictated. The precedent established by Tervingi settlement encouraged similar demands from other groups throughout the territories. Vandals, Alans, Burgundians, and Suevi all pointed to Tervingi, success in extracting concessions through pressure. The government found itself parceling out territory to any confederation capable of fielding substantial combat units. Even more significantly, Adrianople shattered the psychological foundations of authority. For over 4 centuries, the realm had been synonymous with invincibility. Enemies might win individual battles, but they could never achieve decisive strategic victories against armies led by competent commanders and equipped with superior weapons. That myth lay buried in the Thracian mud, along with Valens and his legions. Enemy warriors now knew they could defeat governmental troops in direct combat, capture territories through coordinated campaigns, and extract political concessions through pressure. The realm remained powerful, but it was no longer invincible. The consequences extended far beyond considerations to fundamental questions of political legitimacy and cultural identity. If enemy armies could defeat governmental troops, if hostile settlers could establish independent communities within the realm's borders, if foreign customs could supersede established law, then what distinguished the administration from the kingdoms that surrounded it? These questions would torment leaders for the remainder of the 4th century and beyond. Theodosius achieved temporary success through accommodation and compromise, but his solutions merely postponed rather than resolved the underlying contradictions revealed at Adrianople. When the great emperor died in 395, he left his young sons nominal control over territories that had been fundamentally transformed by the crisis. The East retained enough strength and resources to evolve into the Byzantine state, but the West faced a future of continuous accommodation, with demands backed by armed pressure. The settlement that followed Adrianople had created a new model for relations based on negotiated equality rather than dominance. This model would be replicated throughout the Western territories, as other groups learned to extract similar concessions through the threat or application of armed pressure. The realm that emerged from the crisis bore little resemblance to the unified, centralized state that had dominated the Mediterranean for centuries. Instead, it resembled a confederation of competing authorities, held together by personal relationships, religious obligations, and temporary alliances, rather than institutional loyalty to central government. Adrianople had not destroyed the administration immediately, but it had revealed weaknesses that would prove fatal when subjected to sustained pressure over subsequent decades. The myth of invincibility was gone forever, and with it, the psychological foundations that had sustained authority through previous crises. The Tervingi had learned that desperate courage and tactical innovation could triumph over professional discipline and superior equipment. Soon, other peoples would apply the same lesson, with equally devastating results for the increasingly fragmented territories that still claimed the name of Rome. The death of Theodosius in 395 shattered the last facade of unified command. As the great emperor's body lay cooling in Milan, his legacy crumbled before the funeral pyres had even been lit. 2 children now ruled the civilized world: 11-year-old Arcadius in Constantinople and 10-year-old Honorius in Ravenna. Neither possessed the strength to command respect from a barbershop, much less govern regions stretching from Scotland to Syria. Real power fell to their guardians and generals, men whose personal ambitions far exceeded their loyalty to the dynasty they supposedly served. In the East, the eunuch Rufinus manipulated young Arcadius with promises of pleasure and threats of violence. In the West, the half-Vandal general commanded through his marriage to Theodosius's niece, and his appointment as guardian to both children. This division of control invited catastrophe. The Eastern and Western strongmen despised each other with the particular venom reserved for rivals who understood each other too well. Both were outsiders who had risen through cunning and ruthlessness, rather than birth or genuine merit. Both commanded the loyalty of troops who served them personally, rather than the state they claimed to represent. Both were willing to sacrifice entire provinces to advance their personal interests. Into this power vacuum stepped a young Visigothic nobleman whose ambitions matched the chaos surrounding him. Unlike the desperate refugees who had crossed the Danube 20 years earlier, this leader represented a new generation who had grown up within the administrative system while maintaining their ethnic identities. He spoke Latin as fluently as his native Gothic, understood bureaucracy as well as warfare, and possessed the diplomatic skills needed to navigate the treacherous waters of late 4th century politics. Yet the Gothic prince also embodied the contradictions that would destroy the western regions. He had served as a federal commander in Theodosius's army, leading warriors in campaigns against usurpers and rebels. His fighters had battled loyally for the deceased emperor, expecting rewards of land, gold, and high office that never materialized. When Theodosius died, the chieftain found himself commanding an army without a patron, leading a people without a homeland, and possessing skills that no legitimate administration seemed willing to purchase. The leader initially sought accommodation with the new regime. His people had served faithfully for 2 decades and deserved better treatment than they had received. They needed permanent lands where they could settle their families, raise their children, and practice their Arian Christianity without persecution. They wanted recognition as federates rather than mere mercenaries, with all the legal protections and political rights that federal status implied. The Western general's response revealed the fatal arrogance that would characterize policy for the next decade. He dismissed demands with contempt, suggesting that people should be grateful for whatever scraps the administration chose to provide. He refused to grant permanent settlement rights, denied the chieftain the high office he sought, and made clear that ethnic troops were expendable tools rather than valued allies. This rejection transformed a potential supporter into an implacable enemy. The Gothic leader withdrew his people from federal service and began organizing independent operations designed to extract through force what had been denied through negotiation. In 396, his warriors swept through Greece like a scythe through wheat, capturing Athens, Corinth, and Sparta, while official forces watched helplessly from their fortifications. The campaign demonstrated capabilities that transcended traditional warfare. The army moved with discipline and coordination that suggested sophisticated planning and logistics. They besieged cities effectively, administered captured regions efficiently, and maintained unit cohesion throughout months of continuous operations. Most impressively, they adapted their tactics to exploit administrative weaknesses while neutralizing traditional advantages in equipment and training. The half-Vandal commander finally responded in 397, leading a powerful force into Greece to confront the threat. The subsequent campaign revealed both the general's tactical brilliance and his strategic short-sightedness. He trapped the enemy army in the mountains of Arcadia, cutting their supply lines and seemingly positioning himself for decisive victory. Yet at the moment of triumph, the Western strongman inexplicably allowed the enemy to escape. Some sources suggest he was bribed. Others claim he feared that destroying the Gothic force would strengthen his Eastern rivals. The most likely explanation is that he recognized their value as potential allies in his ongoing struggle against Constantinople and preferred negotiation to annihilation. This decision established a pattern that would prove catastrophic for stability. Instead of eliminating threats decisively, leaders repeatedly chose to accommodate hostile forces in hopes of using them against domestic rivals. Each accommodation encouraged further demands, while each payment established precedents that made future extortion inevitable. The Gothic prince exploited this weakness brilliantly throughout the following decade. He played Eastern and Western administrations against each other, extracting concessions from both while committing himself to neither. When the general offered him command of Illyrian forces, he accepted the appointment while continuing to negotiate with Constantinople. When Arcadius promised him land in Epirus, the leader took the territory while maintaining his western connections. The year 402 brought the first direct threat to Italy itself. The Gothic army crossed the Julian Alps in autumn, descending into the Po Valley like wolves entering a sheepfold. The fertile plains of northern Italy had known no warfare for over a century, their inhabitants grown soft from decades of peace and prosperity. Cities that had dismantled their walls during the Pax Romana found themselves defenseless against enemies who appeared suddenly from mountain passes and river crossings. The half-Vandal general, caught completely off guard by the invasion, struggled to assemble forces adequate to meet this unprecedented challenge. He recalled troops from the Rhine frontier, weakening defenses against Frankish and Alemannic pressure. He hired Hun mercenaries with gold desperately needed for other purposes. He even recruited slaves and gladiators, arming anyone capable of holding a weapon against the advance. The Battle of Pollentia in 403 demonstrated both resilience and underlying weakness. The hastily assembled army fought with desperate courage, finally forcing the invaders to retreat after a day-long struggle that left thousands dead on both sides. Yet the victory felt hollow to those who understood its implications. It had taken the entire effort to defeat a single ethnic army, led by one ambitious chieftain. More ominously, the retreat was tactical rather than strategic. The Gothic leader withdrew to Illyria, where he spent the next few years rebuilding his strength while maintaining pressure through diplomacy and the constant threat of renewed invasion. His mere existence forced the administration to maintain expensive armies in northern Italy, while neglecting other frontiers that faced equally serious threats. The situation deteriorated further when other chieftains learned from this example. Radagaisus, a Germanic leader, commanding perhaps 100,000 followers, invaded Italy in 405 with the explicit goal of carving out permanent holdings. Unlike the Gothic prince, who fought for political recognition and federal status, Radagaisus sought conquest and settlement through overwhelming numbers and savage warfare. The general's response to this new crisis revealed both his tactical brilliance and the system's fundamental vulnerabilities. He defeated Radagaisus decisively at Fiesole in 406, capturing the Germanic chieftain and scattering his followers. Yet this victory required stripping the Rhine frontier of virtually all regular troops, leaving the most vital border in hostile hands, while forces concentrated against a single threat. The consequences became apparent within months. On December 31st, 406, massive confederations crossed the frozen Rhine near Mainz, beginning an invasion that would permanently alter Europe's ethnic and political landscape. Vandals, Alans, and Suevi poured into Gaul in numbers that dwarfed any previous migration, overwhelming local defenses and establishing control over vast regions. This catastrophe exposed the impossible choices facing leadership. The commander could defend Italy by abandoning Gaul, or protect Gaul by leaving Italy vulnerable to the Gothic threat. He could hire ethnic mercenaries to supplement his forces, but only by paying gold that encouraged other groups to demand similar treatment. Every solution created new problems, while existing threats continued to multiply. The general's domestic enemies exploited these difficulties ruthlessly. Honorius, now approaching adulthood, chafed under his guardian's control and listened eagerly to courtiers who blamed the commander for every reversal. The Senate, dominated by aristocrats who resented Germanic influence in administration, whispered that a half-barbarian could never truly serve interests he did not share by blood. Religious tensions added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. The general remained officially Christian, but maintained connections with pagan aristocrats and Aryan ethnic leaders. His enemies portrayed him as a crypto-pagan who undermined Orthodox Christianity through his tolerance of heretical beliefs and traditional practices. These accusations resonated with populations already traumatized by repeated invasions and looking for scapegoats to blame for their suffering. The crisis reached its climax in 408, when rumors spread that the commander was negotiating with the Gothic leader to attack Constantinople and place the administration under Eastern control. Whether these accusations were true remains unclear, but their political impact was devastating. Honorius, convinced of his guardian's treachery, ordered the general's arrest and execution. The great commander's death removed the last effective leader from the administration. His supporters were massacred throughout Italy, their families murdered and their property confiscated. The army units that had served under his command dissolved into chaos as officers fled and soldiers deserted. Ethnic federates who had fought loyally for decades found themselves suddenly suspect and unwelcome in regions they had defended. This purge eliminated not just the general, but the entire network of relationships that had held the system together. Germanic officers who had risen through merit and faithful service were dismissed or executed. Auxiliaries who had provided crucial capabilities were disarmed and expelled. The federal agreements that had maintained frontier stability for generations were unilaterally abrogated. The Gothic response was swift and devastating. In autumn 408, his army crossed the Alps once again, but this time they faced no effective opposition. The forces that had previously contained expansion had been scattered or destroyed. The diplomatic relationships that had provided alternatives to confrontation had been severed. The regions lay defenseless before an enemy who no longer had any reason to negotiate. The army swept through northern Italy like an avalanche, brushing aside token resistance and capturing city after city. Milan, Aquileia, and Cremona opened their gates rather than face siege and sack. The inhabitants who had celebrated the general's death now watched in horror as the consequences of their short-sightedness became apparent. By autumn, the forces had reached the vicinity of the Eternal City itself. For the first time in 800 years, a hostile army camped within sight of the walls that had protected civilization's capital through so many previous crises. The psychological impact was devastating for populations who had grown accustomed to viewing their city as inviolate and eternal. Yet the Gothic leader still preferred negotiation to assault. He understood that capturing the city would be easier than holding it, and that destruction would eliminate the very wealth he sought to acquire. He offered to withdraw in exchange for massive payments of gold and silver, permanent concessions, and recognition of autonomy within the system. The negotiations that followed revealed how thoroughly the crisis had paralyzed decision-making. Honorius, safe in his fortified capital at Ravenna, refused to consider any agreement that acknowledged independence. The Senate, terrified but proud, insisted that the city's dignity required resistance regardless of the consequences. Commanders, lacking both troops and power, could offer no realistic alternatives to either capitulation or destruction. The first siege of the city in 408 lasted only a few weeks. The leader tightened his blockade until starvation forced the Senate to negotiate, then accepted a massive ransom in gold and silver in exchange for temporary withdrawal. The agreement provided breathing space, but solved nothing, as both sides understood that the underlying issues remained unresolved. The chieftain spent 409 maneuvering between various factions, supporting senatorial candidates who promised better terms while maintaining pressure through the constant threat of renewed siege. His diplomatic skills proved as formidable as his combat capabilities, as he played different groups against each other while building coalition support for his demands. Yet Honorius remained intransigent, apparently convinced that divine protection would preserve his throne regardless of earthly circumstances. The emperor's refusal to compromise forced the Gothic prince into increasingly desperate expedients. He could not retreat without losing face among his own followers, nor could he maintain his army indefinitely without the resources that only a permanent settlement could provide. The breaking point came in 410, when negotiations collapsed completely over questions of concessions and federal recognition. The leader had demanded permanent settlement rights in Noricum and Venetia, regions that would provide his people with agricultural resources and his army with strategic bases for future operations. Honorius rejected these demands absolutely, apparently believing that divine intervention would somehow resolve the crisis without political compromise. Faced with impossible choices, the Gothic prince chose the path that would echo through history. On August 24th, 410, his forces breached the city's ancient walls and poured into streets that had remained inviolate for 8 centuries. The sack that followed was relatively restrained by contemporary standards, but its psychological impact dwarfed any physical damage. The eternal city had fallen. The capital that had ruled the Mediterranean world for over 4 centuries lay at the mercy of warriors whose grandparents had been refugees, begging for scraps at administrative borders. The news spread across the known world like wildfire, carrying with it the terrible message that no institution, no matter how ancient or revered, was immune to destruction. Yet even in victory, the Gothic leader demonstrated the strategic limitations that would prevent success from becoming permanent dominance. His warriors could capture cities, but lacked the administrative skills needed to govern them effectively. They could extract tribute through pressure, but possessed no economic system capable of generating sustainable wealth. Most critically, they remained dependent on bureaucratic structures, even as they destroyed bureaucratic power. The chieftain died just months after his greatest triumph, struck down by fever while leading his people southward towards Sicily. His death deprived his followers of their most capable leader at the moment when skilled guidance was most essential. Without his diplomatic abilities and strategic vision, his successors would struggle to transform success into political stability. The immediate aftermath of the sack revealed how thoroughly the system had collapsed. Honorius, safe in Ravenna, issued proclamations declaring victory over the invaders, while his capital smoldered and his subjects fled in all directions. The Senate passed resolutions condemning violence, while frantically negotiating with successors for better treatment. Provincial governors abandoned their posts to protect their personal estates, while their regions dissolved into chaos. Most significantly, the sack demonstrated that official power now depended entirely on ethnic goodwill. The invaders withdrew from the city, not because they had been defeated, but because they chose to seek opportunities elsewhere. Their restraint in limiting destruction reflected political calculation rather than administrative strength. The bureaucracy survived by sufferance rather than force. The precedent established by this success would haunt the regions for the remainder of their existence. Every confederation now knew that determined pressure could extract political concessions and grants from administrations too weak to resist effectively. The myth of invincibility, already damaged at Adrianople, had been utterly destroyed by the violation of the Eternal City. More fundamentally, the crisis had revealed the bankruptcy of traditional solutions to contemporary problems. Force alone could not secure frontiers when potential enemies outnumbered available defenders. Diplomatic accommodation could not satisfy demands without destroying the structures that made accommodation possible. Economic pressure could not fund adequate defenses when the tax base was shrinking and costs were rising exponentially. The regions that emerged from the crisis bore little resemblance to the unified state that had once dominated Europe. Instead of a single administration commanding unified obedience, a patchwork of competing powers struggled for control over an increasingly fragmented landscape. Ethnic settlements, autonomous cities, independent warlords, and nominal officials shared power in arrangements that satisfied no one while threatening everyone. The sack of the Eternal City marked not just the end of urban invincibility, but the beginning of a new era in which survival depended on accommodation, with forces that previous generations would have considered unthinkably hostile. The age of administrative dominance was ending, and the age of ethnic kingdoms was about to begin. The ashes of the Eternal City had barely cooled when new predators emerged from the chaos, drawn by the scent of weakness like sharks to blood. The violation of the ancient capital had shattered more than walls and buildings. It had destroyed the psychological barriers that had protected civilization for centuries. Every ambitious chieftain, every displaced people, every opportunistic warlord now understood that the unthinkable was not only possible, but profitable. From the forests of Germania came a confederation whose very name would become synonymous with destruction. Under King Gyseric, these fierce warriors had learned lessons that transcended mere warfare. They possessed not only the courage to challenge established power, but the strategic vision to exploit its weaknesses systematically. Unlike previous invaders who sought temporary plunder, this people pursued permanent conquest with methodical precision. Their path to greatness began in the most unlikely fashion. Invited into Spain by a usurper seeking allies against legitimate government, they initially appeared as just another group of mercenaries selling their swords to the highest bidder. Yet the king understood that such arrangements were temporary at best. True security required not employment, but dominion, not service, but sovereignty. The opportunity came when domestic rivals turned against their hosts. Spanish leaders, alarmed by increasing demands and violent behavior, attempted to expel the newcomers through force of arms. This miscalculation proved catastrophic. The warriors who had seemed useful as allies became terrifying as enemies, sweeping across the Iberian Peninsula with systematic ruthlessness that left entire regions depopulated. But Spain represented merely a stepping stone to greater ambitions. Gyseric's strategic genius lay in recognizing that control of the sea would matter more than possession of any single territory. While other leaders exhausted themselves fighting for particular cities or provinces, the Vandal king built a naval force capable of projecting power across the entire Mediterranean basin. The crossing to North Africa in 429 marked a turning point not just for the Vandals, but for the entire balance of power in the crumbling realm. 80,000 people, warriors, families, servants, and slaves, embarked on ships that would carry them from poverty to prosperity, from dependence to dominance. The expedition represented one of the largest seaborne migrations in ancient history. a carefully planned operation that demonstrated capabilities far beyond traditional expectations. Count Boniface, the regional commander responsible for defending North Africa, found himself facing an impossible situation. His forces were adequate for suppressing local revolts or repelling modest raids, but they could not contain a full-scale invasion led by experienced warriors and supported by a substantial civilian population. Worse yet, domestic political intrigue had isolated him from potential reinforcements and undermined his local support. The advance proceeded with terrifying efficiency. City after city fell to assault or surrendered rather than face destruction. The fertile coastal plains that had fed much of the Mediterranean world for centuries passed under hostile control. Most critically, the great port of Hippo Regius, where Augustine himself had served as bishop, endured a siege that became symbolic of civilization's retreat before barbarism. Yet even the fall of individual cities paled beside the strategic implications of this success. North Africa had provided not merely grain, but gold, the tax revenues that funded administrative operations throughout the remaining territories. The region's agricultural surplus had fed populations from Britain to Constantinople, while its commercial networks had carried trade goods across 3 continents. The loss of these resources created cascading crises that no amount of diplomatic maneuvering could resolve. Tax collection collapsed in regions that could no longer export their products through North African ports. Urban populations faced starvation as grain shipments ceased or became prohibitively expensive. Administrative systems that had functioned for centuries simply stopped working when their financial foundations disappeared. The king understood these implications better than most contemporary observers. His conquest of Carthage in 439 was not merely another victory, but a stroke of strategic genius that transformed the Mediterranean balance of power. From this ancient commercial hub, fleets could strike any target within hundreds of miles, while remaining secure from retaliation. The tables had turned completely. Former subjects now dictated terms to their former masters. The psychological impact matched the material consequences. Carthage had been the Republic's greatest rival for centuries, the city whose destruction had marked its emergence as a Mediterranean hegemon. Now it served as the capital of a kingdom that mocked everything classical civilization claimed to represent. The symbolism was lost on no one who understood the region's history. Yet even as the African conquests were consolidated, a far more terrible threat was gathering strength in the Hungarian plains. The nomadic horsemen who had triggered the Gothic migrations decades earlier were evolving from a loose confederation of tribes into a centralized kingdom under the most fearsome leader in European history. The great warlord differed from previous chieftains in ways that made him uniquely dangerous to settled civilizations. While his predecessors had been content with raiding and tribute collection, this leader possessed ambitions that encompassed the entire continent. He combined traditional mobility and ferocity with administrative techniques and diplomatic sophistication, learned through decades of contact with both Eastern and governmental courts. The nomadic confederation, under his leadership, represented something unprecedented in European history. A mobile state capable of matching sedentary civilizations in organizational complexity, while retaining all the advantages of mounted warfare. His armies could move faster than any opponent, strike with devastating force, then disappear before effective retaliation could be organized. Yet they also possessed the logistical capabilities needed for sustained campaigns against fortified positions. More ominously, the Confederation attracted not only traditional nomadic allies, but also Germanic tribes seeking protection or opportunity. Ostrogoths, Gepids, and other peoples who had once served as buffers against expansion now provided auxiliary forces for the great armies. The demographic balance that had protected settled regions for centuries was shifting decisively in favor of mobile peoples. The first major test of this new threat came in Gaul, where forces appeared in 451, with an army that contemporary sources numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The invasion combined strategic planning with tactical innovation in ways that suggested careful preparation rather than opportunistic raiding. Cities that had never faced hostile armies found themselves under siege by enemies who seemed to appear from nowhere and fight with supernatural ferocity. Yet the advance also triggered an unprecedented response from the fragmenting territories. Aetius, the last great general of the declining administration, managed to assemble a coalition that included not only regular forces, but also the very Gothic federates who had sacked the capital 40 years earlier. The alliance demonstrated how thoroughly the political landscape had changed. Former enemies now fought together against a common threat that overshadowed their previous conflicts. The Battle of Chalons represented perhaps the last moment when united action might have preserved some semblance of traditional order. The combined Romano-Gothic army fought with desperate courage against forces that seemed limitless in number and terrifying in their ferocity. For hours, the outcome remained uncertain, as cavalry charges and infantry assaults created a carnage that contemporary witnesses described as apocalyptic. Victory, when it came, proved as costly as defeat might have been. The Allied forces succeeded in forcing the great warlord's withdrawal, but at enormous cost in lives and resources that could never be replaced. More significantly, the battle demonstrated that even successful resistance required accommodating forces that had once been considered unacceptably hostile. The price of survival was the abandonment of principles that had once defined civilization itself. The nomadic response to this setback revealed the sophistication that made their leader so dangerous. Rather than accepting defeat, he simply shifted his attention to more vulnerable targets. The following year brought armies into northern Italy, where they encountered even less effective resistance than they had faced in Gaul. Cities that had survived Gothic raids and African threats found themselves helpless before an enemy whose capabilities exceeded anything they had previously encountered. The famous meeting between the warlord and Pope Leo I outside the capital became legendary not for its religious significance, but for its demonstration of how thoroughly power relationships had changed. The spiritual leader of Christianity negotiated with a pagan chieftain as an equal, pleading for mercy rather than demanding submission. The scene symbolized the new reality. Survival depended on accommodation, with forces that previous generations would have considered beneath notice. Yet the conqueror's sudden death in 453 provided unexpected relief for territories that had seemed doomed to destruction. The great leader died on his wedding night, apparently from a hemorrhage that some sources attributed to excessive drinking. His death triggered immediate civil war among his sons and subordinates, fragmenting the confederation and eliminating the most serious external threat to European civilization. The relief proved temporary. Nomadic pressure had forced so many peoples into motion that removing their leadership did not restore stability. Germanic tribes that had served in the great armies now competed for territory and resources in a landscape where traditional leadership had lost most of their power. The collapse of unity created not peace, but chaos, as dozens of smaller groups pursued their own interests without central coordination. More immediately, the death removed the external threat that had forced cooperation between otherwise hostile factions within the remaining territories. Aetius, who had achieved hero status through his victory at Chalons, found himself increasingly isolated as domestic rivals questioned his loyalty and effectiveness. The Gothic federates who had fought alongside him now demanded ever greater concessions as payment for their continued support. The general's assassination by Emperor Valentinian III in 454 eliminated the last competent leader from administration. Aetius died during a palace ceremony, struck down by the emperor's own sword in front of assembled courtiers. The murder was apparently motivated by fears that the general's popularity and Gothic connections posed a threat to central control. The irony was devastating. The man who had saved civilization from the nomads was killed by the ruler he had served faithfully. Valentinian's triumph lasted exactly 1 year. In 455, Aetius's supporters murdered the emperor in revenge for their commander's death, triggering another succession crisis that revealed how thoroughly the system had collapsed. The man who had orchestrated the last effective resistance to external threats was dead, killed by internal enemies who understood neither the gravity of their situation nor the consequences of their actions. The African response was swift and merciless. The king, who had been building his naval forces, while other powers exhausted themselves against the nomads, saw opportunity in the chaos following Valentinian's death. His fleet appeared off the coast of Italy in early summer, carrying an army prepared for the systematic exploitation of administrative paralysis. The second sack of the capital in 455 differed qualitatively from the Gothic violation 45 years earlier. Where the earlier attack had been relatively restrained, motivated by political demands rather than pure destruction, the assault was methodical and thorough. The king's forces stripped the city of everything valuable, from religious artifacts to architectural ornaments, loading their ships with wealth that had accumulated over centuries. The psychological impact exceeded even the material damage. The Eternal City had now been violated twice within living memory, demonstrating that no institution or tradition could claim immunity from destruction. The populations who had celebrated recovery from the first sack now watched helplessly as their city was plundered again by enemies who seemed to appear and disappear at will. More significantly, the success established a new model for profitable warfare that other groups would soon emulate. Rather than seeking permanent conquest of specific territories, mobile forces could extract wealth through systematic raiding, while avoiding the burdens of administration and defense. The Mediterranean was becoming a hunting ground, where predators struck at will against prey too weak to resist effectively. The years following the second sack witnessed the complete fragmentation of effective leadership throughout the regions. Provincial governors, who had maintained some semblance of central control, were assassinated, expelled, or simply abandoned their posts when they could no longer pay their soldiers or protect their territories. Local strongmen filled the resulting power vacuum, establishing autonomous domains that acknowledged no higher command. Germanic settlements that had once accepted federal status now declared complete independence, their leaders adopting royal titles and establishing hereditary dynasties. The Burgundians in southeastern Gaul, the Suevi in northwestern Spain, and the Visigoths in southwestern Gaul all evolved from federal allies into sovereign kingdoms that conducted their own diplomacy and minted their own currency. Urban populations faced impossible choices as traditional support systems collapsed around them. Many cities simply emptied as residents fled to rural areas where they might find protection under local warlords or ethnic chieftains. Others survived by accepting tributary status under whoever could provide security, regardless of their ethnic background or previous political affiliations. The economic foundations of civilization crumbled along with political structures. Trade networks that had connected Britain to Egypt and Spain to Constantinople fragmented into local systems that served regional needs rather than continental commerce. Monetary systems based on central currency gave way to barter arrangements and primitive banking that reflected the new political reality. Cultural synthesis that had sustained classical learning for centuries accelerated toward complete breakdown. Schools closed for lack of students and funding. Libraries were abandoned or destroyed as their communities fled or submitted to illiterate conquerors. The Latin language began fragmenting into regional dialects that would eventually become separate languages entirely. Religious life provided the only institution capable of transcending ethnic and political divisions, but even Christianity faced serious challenges in this environment. Arian and Orthodox communities competed for converts and political favor, while trying to maintain their theological integrity. Many bishops found themselves serving as civil administrators in territories where no other leadership remained functional. The most ominous development was the complete collapse of effective organization. Regular armies that had defended frontiers for centuries either disbanded or transformed into personal retinues serving individual commanders. Recruitment systems that had channeled young men into disciplined service disappeared as potential soldiers chose banditry or mercenary service over unpaid government duty. By 455, the territories bore no resemblance to the unified state that had emerged from the crisis of the 3rd century. Instead of a single command structure demanding obedience from Scotland to Morocco, dozens of competing powers struggled for control over an increasingly fragmented landscape. The age of unified rule was ending, and the age of medieval kingdoms was about to begin. Yet perhaps the most significant change was psychological rather than political. Populations who had grown up expecting protection from central leadership now understood that survival depended on local arrangements with whoever could provide security. The habits of civic participation and loyalty that had sustained classical civilization were giving way to personal relationships and ethnic solidarity that would characterize the medieval world. The African kingdom, the nomadic confederation in Central Europe, and the various Germanic kingdoms in Gaul and Spain represented not aberrations, but the new normal. Traditional command had become so weak that it could survive only by accommodating forces that previous generations would have considered unthinkably hostile. The transformation was irreversible, and its completion was only a matter of time. The wolves had tasted blood, and now they circled the dying carcass of what had once been the mightiest power on earth. After the second violation of the Eternal City in 455, any pretense of central control evaporated like morning mist. What remained was not an administration, but a collection of competing warlords, puppet rulers, and opportunistic strongmen who fought over the remnants of a civilization they could no longer comprehend, much less govern. Into this power vacuum stepped a figure who would define the final 2 decades of decline. A half-Suevi general whose Germanic blood made him ineligible for the purple, but whose ambition knew no such constitutional limits. This cunning warlord understood that real power lay not in wearing the crown, but in controlling whoever did. Over the next 16 years, he would make and unmake rulers with casual brutality, turning the highest office in the civilized world into a prize for whoever could pay his price or serve his purposes. The general's rise demonstrated how thoroughly traditional institutions had collapsed. The Senate, once the deliberative body of a republic, now functioned as little more than a social club for frightened aristocrats who endorsed whatever decisions their Germanic protectors made. The army, which had once conquered the known world, existed only as private retinues, serving individual commanders who owed allegiance to no higher cause than personal enrichment. The kingmaker's first puppet was Majorian, elevated to the throne in 457 through his backing and Germanic muscle. Yet this choice would prove far more troublesome than the warlord had anticipated. Unlike the pliable figureheads who typically filled such roles, the new ruler possessed both competence and genuine ambition to restore something resembling effective governance. Majorian's brief reign represented the last flickering of administrative capability in the dying territories. He rebuilt naval forces that had been neglected for decades, organized expeditions to reclaim lost provinces, and attempted to restore the tax collection systems that had once funded governmental operations. His legal reforms addressed corruption that had become endemic, while his diplomatic initiatives sought to transform hostile tribes into reliable allies through negotiation rather than force. For 3 years, his efforts seemed to achieve miraculous results. Gallic cities that had submitted to Germanic rule returned to central control. Spanish provinces that had been written off as permanently lost acknowledged his sovereignty. Even Britain, abandoned for half a century, sent embassies exploring the possibility of renewed connections with continental administration. Yet Majorian's very success guaranteed his destruction. The kingmaker had elevated a figurehead, not a rival. The ruler's growing independence and popular support threatened the delicate balance of power that kept the Germanic general in control. When Majorian began recruiting new army units loyal to the throne rather than individual commanders, he signed his own death warrant. The end came in 461, when the strong man's agents captured Majorian near Tortona and executed him after a brief show trial. The official story blamed plotting against the state, but everyone understood the real crime. He had tried to govern rather than merely reign. His death sent a clear message to any future ruler who might harbor similar delusions about the nature of their office. The puppet who replaced him, Libius Severus, embodied everything the warlord demanded in a figurehead. He possessed no military experience, commanded no personal loyalty from the troops, and showed no interest in actual governance beyond the ceremonial functions that legitimized Germanic control. For 4 years, Severus served as the perfect placeholder, while real decisions were made in the strongman's headquarters rather than the palace. This arrangement satisfied the Germanic strongman, but solved none of the underlying problems that were destroying what remained of civilized order. Tax revenues continued their inexorable decline as productive regions either fell under hostile control or simply stopped acknowledging central authority. Urban populations shrank as residents fled to rural areas where local warlords could provide better protection than distant government officials. The collapse extended beyond mere administrative failure to fundamental alterations in how society functioned. Latin, which had been the language of law and learning throughout the Mediterranean world, fragmented into regional dialects as centralized education systems disappeared. Trade networks that had connected distant provinces for centuries broke down as roads became impassable and maritime commerce too dangerous to pursue profitably. Religious life provided the only institution capable of maintaining some semblance of continuity, but even the church faced unprecedented challenges. Bishops found themselves serving as civil administrators in territories where no other authority remained functional. Arian and Orthodox communities competed for political favor while trying to maintain their theological integrity amid the chaos surrounding them. When Severus died in 465, the kingmaker faced a dilemma that revealed his strategic limitations. The Eastern ruler, Zeno, refused to recognize any candidate who lacked legitimacy beyond Germanic military support. Yet genuinely capable leaders posed the same threat to the general's position that had made Majorian's elimination necessary. The solution was to leave the throne vacant for 2 years, while negotiations proceeded with Constantinople. The eventual compromise produced Anthemius, a capable general with impeccable credentials, who arrived from the east with substantial military and financial backing. His elevation in 467 briefly renewed hope that effective leadership might yet preserve some remnant of traditional order. The new sovereign commanded respect from both military commanders and civilian administrators, while his eastern connections promised resources that had been unavailable for decades. Yet Anthemius's very qualifications made him unsuitable for the subordinate role the warlord required. The ruler began appointing his own supporters to key positions, bypassing the Germanic general's network of clients and allies. He initiated diplomatic contacts with African and Gothic leaders without consulting his supposed protector. Most dangerously, he began rebuilding the central army as a force loyal to the throne rather than individual strongmen. The inevitable conflict erupted in 472 when Anthemius attempted to remove the kingmaker from command. The resulting civil war devastated what little remained of organized government in Italy. Germanic federates fought alongside regular troops in street battles that turned cities into battlefields. The sovereign died defending his palace, while hostile forces systematically eliminated his supporters throughout the peninsula. Victory proved as hollow as defeat might have been. The strong man had preserved his position, but destroyed the last vestiges of administrative capability in the process. He died later that same year, apparently from natural causes, leaving behind a power structure so fragmented that no single successor could claim his authority. The kingmaker system he had perfected died with him, replaced by an even more chaotic arrangement of competing warlords. The brief reign of Glycerius, elevated by the deceased general's nephew Gundobad, demonstrated how thoroughly the situation had deteriorated. This puppet sovereign controlled little beyond the immediate vicinity of Ravenna, while provincial commanders, Germanic chieftains, and local strongmen carved up the remaining territories among themselves. The fiction of central government persisted only because no one bothered to formally abolish institutions that had already ceased to function. Eastern intervention in 474 brought yet another attempt at restoration through the appointment of Julius Nepos, a capable administrator backed by substantial military forces from Constantinople. His brief reign represented the last serious effort to preserve some semblance of traditional order in the fragmented territories. Nepos reformed taxation systems, rebuilt diplomatic relationships with neighboring kingdoms, and attempted to restore central control over provincial governors. Yet even this well-intentioned effort could not overcome the fundamental problems that had been accumulating for decades. The economic base needed to support effective government had been eroded beyond repair. The military forces required to impose central authority either no longer existed or served masters who would not accept subordination to distant rulers. Most critically, the populations who might have supported restoration efforts had lost faith in the possibility of effective governance. The final act began in 475, when Orestes, a former secretary to Attila, who had risen to command the remaining central forces, rebelled against Nepos and drove him into exile. This coup differed from previous power struggles in that Orestes made no attempt to claim the throne himself. Instead, he elevated his young son, Romulus, to the purple, apparently believing that a child sovereign would provide perfect cover for his own exercise of power. The choice of name proved grimly prophetic. Romulus Augustus, mockingly called Augustulus or Little Augustus by contemporaries, represented everything the office had become: a helpless child dependent on Germanic protectors, commanding no real authority, governing territories that barely acknowledged his existence. At perhaps 14 years old, he embodied the complete infantilization of institutions that had once commanded the respect of the civilized world. Yet even this degraded arrangement could not survive the final crisis that emerged in 476. Germanic federates serving under Orestes demanded territorial grants similar to those that had been awarded to other tribes throughout the collapsing territories. When their requests were refused, apparently due to lack of available land rather than principled opposition, they found a new leader willing to support their demands through force. Odoacer represented a new type of Germanic leader, one who understood that the time for accommodation with traditional authority had passed. Unlike earlier chieftains who sought recognition within existing systems, he aimed for complete replacement of those systems with arrangements more favorable to his followers. His rebellion was not merely another coup, but a fundamental rejection of the entire structure that had sustained classical civilization for centuries. The campaign that followed demonstrated how completely military capability had collapsed in the remaining territories. Orestes' forces melted away when confronted by determined opposition, their loyalty purchased too recently and too cheaply to withstand serious testing. The father died fighting near Pavia, while his teenage son huddled in Ravenna, waiting for rescue that would never come. On September 4th, 476, Odoacer's forces entered Ravenna without significant resistance. The Germanic chieftain found the last sovereign cowering in his palace, surrounded by a handful of courtiers who had nowhere else to go. What followed was not the dramatic confrontation that poets might have imagined, but a bureaucratic transaction that reflected the prosaic reality of how great institutions actually die. Odoacer treated the boy with surprising gentleness, apparently recognizing that Romulus was more victim than villain in the tragedy that had unfolded. The youth was granted a generous pension and allowed to retire to a villa in Campania, where he would live quietly for many years as a private citizen. His fate symbolized the transformation of an office that had once commanded absolute obedience from hundreds of millions of subjects. More significantly, Odoacer made no attempt to claim the title for himself. Instead, he gathered the regalia that had symbolized Western authority for over 4 centuries: the purple robes, the golden diadem, the ceremonial staff, and dispatched them to Constantinople with a message that required no elaborate explanation. The West no longer needed a sovereign, because the West no longer existed as a political entity capable of sustaining such government. The Eastern ruler, Zeno's response, revealed how thoroughly the situation was understood by contemporary observers. He accepted the regalia without protest, issued official statements recognizing Odoacer as his representative in Italy, and made no serious effort to restore independence. The fiction of unified authority was maintained, but everyone understood that it was indeed a fiction. The aftermath unfolded with surprising tranquility. Cities that had expected sack and slaughter found themselves under new management that seemed primarily interested in maintaining order and collecting taxes. Administrative systems that had barely functioned under the last rulers continued their decline, but at a pace that seemed almost leisurely compared to the chaos of previous decades. Local populations, exhausted by generations of warfare and uncertainty, generally accepted the change with resignation or even relief. Germanic rule might be alien, but it offered stability that had been absent under the final sovereigns. The chieftains who emerged from the wreckage often proved more effective at basic governmental functions than the puppet rulers they replaced. Yet the symbolic impact transcended immediate practical consequences. For over 1,000 years, the name had represented permanence in a world of constant change. The city that had conquered the Mediterranean basin established law codes that would influence jurisprudence for millennia, and created architectural marvels that still inspired awe had finally succumbed to forces it could no longer resist or accommodate. The collapse was neither sudden nor dramatic, but rather the culmination of processes that had been developing for centuries. Military expansion had created defensive requirements that exceeded available resources. Economic pressures had forced accommodations with hostile forces that gradually undermined the very foundations of traditional authority. Political divisions had weakened central institutions, while strengthening regional powers that eventually dispensed with any pretense of subordination. Perhaps most importantly, the cultural synthesis that had sustained classical civilization for centuries had finally broken down completely. The educated classes who had preserved and transmitted Greek and Roman learning either fled to safer regions or adapted their skills to serve new masters. The urban populations, who had provided the economic foundation for imperial government, scattered to rural areas where they accepted protection from local strongmen rather than distant authorities. The Latin language, which had unified diverse peoples across 3 continents, fragmented into regional dialects that would eventually become entirely separate languages. Legal systems based on Roman jurisprudence gave way to Germanic customs that reflected very different assumptions about individual rights and social obligations. Religious practices evolved to accommodate the theological preferences of Arian rulers who viewed Orthodox Christianity with suspicion or hostility. The roads that had carried Roman legions to the ends of the earth fell into disrepair as maintenance systems collapsed and trade volumes declined. Aqueducts that had supplied cities with clean water for centuries cracked and leaked as engineering knowledge was lost and repair resources diverted to more immediate needs. Public buildings that had symbolized Roman permanence were stripped of their marble and bronze to provide building materials for more modest projects. Yet even as the territories fragmented into kingdoms that bore little resemblance to their predecessor, the Eastern realm continued to function under rulers who still claimed the title. Constantinople remained a major power center, its wealth and population dwarfing anything that could be found in the former regions. The Byzantine state would endure for nearly another 1,000 years, preserving Greek versions of law and maintaining diplomatic relationships with the Germanic kingdoms that had emerged from collapse. The survival of the Eastern territories highlighted the contingent nature of failure. Geography, economics, and political decisions had created different trajectories for regions that had once been part of a unified system. The East possessed defensible frontiers, reliable food supplies, and recruitment populations that enabled effective resistance to external pressures. The West lacked these advantages and made political choices that accelerated rather than mitigated the consequences of its vulnerabilities. Looking back from the perspective of later centuries, observers would debate whether different decisions might have produced different outcomes. Could more effective leadership have preserved unity? Would accommodation with Germanic demands have been preferable to resistance that ultimately failed? Might religious uniformity have provided sufficient social cohesion to overcome political fragmentation? Such questions remain unanswerable, but the pattern of collapse offers insights that transcend its particular historical context. Complex systems can appear stable for centuries, while developing internal contradictions that make eventual breakdown inevitable. Military success can create obligations that exceed the economic foundations needed to sustain them. Cultural synthesis can mask underlying tensions that emerge during periods of stress and uncertainty. The end came not with a bang, but with a whimper, not through dramatic military defeat, but through the quiet abandonment of institutions that had lost their relevance to contemporary realities. The last sovereign was not killed in battle, but pensioned off to comfortable retirement. The regalia were not destroyed, but carefully packaged and shipped to rulers who might find some use for them. On September 4th, 476, the Western territories ended, not because they were conquered, but because they were no longer necessary. The regions they had claimed to govern were better served by local arrangements that reflected ethnic loyalties, regional interests, and practical accommodations with forces that had once been considered unacceptably foreign. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and, perhaps most remarkably, largely peaceful. The age of sovereignty had ended, and the age of kings had begun.